And once we have our form, now let's start setting up our functionality. And we'll start by going over the GitHub API one more time, where as far as the GitHub API, if we would want to have a root endpoint, so this is where all our requests are going to start. The endpoint would be HTTPS, then colon, then two forward slashes, API, and github.com. So that's where we'll start. Now, if we would want to have user, then we're going to go with forward slash and users, then whatever user. And we can already imagine that this is how we're going to perform the fetch request, where we're going to take the user out of the search component and just place it in our AJAX request. Then if we would want to have repos, again, we go with users, then user, whoever it is, and then we're looking for repos. Now, by default, you're going to get 30 repos. That's why we're adding this query here where I'm saying, yeah, get me please the 100. So this just gives us a 100 repos instead of 30. And the same thing I'm doing here for the followers, where essentially I'm just adding the per page as well. Now I haven't added it to a README, but eventually it's going to be there. Where again, we're getting for the followers and we're getting our 100 per page. And last thing that we can do is we can check the rate limit. And essentially, this does not use our request, so we can do it as many times as we would want. And of course, if we want to check it out, how that'll work, well, we can simply copy the URL, head over to a browser. The browser is going to perform a GET request, and there it is. So that's what we're going to get back. And in here, I can see that I have a limit of 60. That's the default one, and I have the remaining one. And it also tells me when it's going to be reset. Because remember, we got 60 requests per hour. So here's what I would want to do. In our application, the moment I load my application, I would want to set up a request to get how many requests I still can do. And then depending on that, I right away would want to, for example, display the error if there are no requests available, if we have used all of them. And also, for example, hide the search button, because that's just going to signal to a user that, hey, listen, you cannot do any more requests. So let's do that. I'm going to head over to my context, because this is where we'll set up our logic. And in order to perform a AJAX request, I'm going to use the Axios library. Now, if you want, of course, you can use fetch as well. That's up to you, but there's just some things that I like about Axios. And of course, it is already installed in dependencies, so you can right away use it. And I'm right away importing in the context. So what I would want is the moment my application loads, I would want to perform a fetch request where it gets me the rate limit. So essentially, it gets me the info of how many requests the user can do. So then we can do multiple things once we have that data. And we already know that in order to perform that kind of request, we most likely would use a use effect, because that runs after each and every render, correct? Now, we also know that it would probably be useful if we would have some kind of state variable. So let's start over there, where I'm going to go with requests. And then also I'm going to say loading, because I'm also going to add that right away, even though at the moment it's not going to make much sense, meaning we're not going to work on loading just yet, but eventually we will. So in here we go with requests. And then of course the function is set requests, and that is equal to my use state. And I'll just say that at the very start, the value is going to be 0. So by default, it's 0. And of course, once I check, then I'm going to display the proper value. And also, like I said, I would want to work on my loading. So we're going to go with const, and then loading, then set is loading, and that is equal to my use state. And if you want, by default, you can set it to true. But in my case, I'm just going to go with false. And then eventually there's also going to be something for the errors, but since we're going to cover that in the next video, I'm just going to leave the comment here. Error. Okay. Now, once we have this set up, Now I would want to set up my use effect. And then for the time being, just going to be an empty function that just console logs, hey, everything works. So we go with use effect. Then remember, we had to pass in callback function. And then since I would only want to run my use effect once, I'll pass in my dependency array and I'll set it to an equal array. I'm sorry, do an empty array. And let's go with console log, hey, app loaded. All right, let's navigate to bigger screen. I enjoy always console on a bigger screen, so let's refresh, and we should see somewhere the console log. Hey, the app loaded. Beautiful. So now let's set up our function. So the function that hits the GitHub API, but not just some random URL, essentially we'll check for that rate limit. So what we could do is go back to context. I already have the root URL. So this is just going to help you to set up the requests because you can always just reference the variable. And let's set up our function where I'm going to close the sidebar now. And above the use effect, I think that should be a good place. We're going to go with a comment of check and then rate. And then let's go with const check requests. That's the name of my function. As always, you can call it however you like, as far as you remember how it's called later. So please don't call it banana and then try to invoke the check request, because of course that's not going to work. And the way Axios work, by default, it's a get request. This is exactly what we would want. So we just type Axios, and then I'm going to access my root URL, then /, and remember the address that I was looking for was rate and then a limit. And then since Axios returns a promise, we can right away do two things where I could set up then. So this is where I'm going to be looking for the data that I'm getting back. So this is my callback function. So I'm just going to pass here data, or you can name this response. And also I'll right away set up the catch where I'm going to say, yeah, catch. And if there is an error, then just console log it. So we'll go with console log and then error. Okay. And of course, now what I would want is to invoke it once the app loads. Now we could technically pass check requests in the use effect. We could do something like this. So check requests, but what's a little bit annoying that right now you'll see in warnings that essentially we haven't added check requests to our dependency array. Again, it's not the end of the world, but definitely that warning is there. Now, at the moment, I can see that, of course, there's many, many warnings. So maybe this is not the most useful one, but eventually, yeah, I can tell you right away that it's there. That's why what I'm going to do instead is, instead of passing this as an empty arrow function, I'm just going to say, yeah, once the app loads, then just use check request as our callback function. And that's something that I haven't included in my previous project. That's why I purposely set it up this way. And now we should see our data. So we should see our data. Now, of course, nothing is there at the moment because I didn't do anything with that. So I'm going to go with console log data. And essentially, we should get back the same object. Okay. Now, of course, in this time, this is going to be in a console. And then since we are using Axios, we get a response from the Axios. And right away, we have everything in JSON. So we don't need to run this .json method like you would with fetch. That's also a very neat feature. And then the data is going to be, of course, if the request is successful, in the data property. So you're getting back the object. And then from that object, you would want to destructure data. So instead of just looking for a response, I'm going to go here with destructuring my data out. And then again, we can do the same thing. Now we're just going to console log our data. And again, our lab loads. And then the rate is going to be in the rate property. And then we have the limit, we have remaining, and we have the reset. So now I would want to destructure that remaining out of the data. So let's go back. We're not going to console log in this time. We're just going to say let, and then rate. So first property is rate, and in the rate we have remaining that we would want the structure out of the data. And yes, I'm fully aware that of course we can destructure it here as well, but just for change, I went into a new line. And now what I would want is to set my requests. Notice these ones, I would want to set them to this value, to the one that I'm getting back, of course. And in here, I'm going to say set requests. So set requests, and then let's pass in the remaining. Now we also need to right away check if the remaining is 0. So we're going to go with if and then remaining. If it is 0, then of course I know that I don't have requests. So now I'd want to throw an error, and we'll do that in the next video. So throw an error, okay, if the request is 0. If not, then we'll set our remaining, correct? Meaning we'll set our requests, and then of course, if the remaining is 0, if there are no more requests, then we would want to do something. Then we would want to hide the search button because there's no point of showing that button since the user cannot perform requests anyway. And also I'd want to throw the error. Similarly, like I showed you before, where if the user is not there, we'll do something similar. Where, and by the way, of course, that user has to be there. Still this one as well. So let's say, yeah, well, this one doesn't exist. So there's no user. So we'll do the same thing when there are no requests, meaning we have used up all our requests. However, we'll also hide this button. So now once we have those requests, once I have it here in my state, we know that we can nicely pass it down, correct? So I could say, yeah, pass down requests. Okay, beautiful. And now in the search, of course, I would want to access that. So either you can do it before or after, doesn't really matter. As far as the user, now I'd want to access some things from my global state. And now I'd want to start working on them. So I'm going to go here with const, and then we're going to look for my requests because that's what I passed in. And that is coming from React, then use context. And then of course we pass in the GitHub context. And in here, just so I don't run around like a headless chicken, I'm just going to check whether I'm getting something there as far as the value. Otherwise, it's not going to be pretty watching me trying to debug the application. Of course, there it is. I have 47. So what we can do next? Well, we can use this one and of course start by just setting up here the request. So let's do that. Let's say requests over here. Okay, beautiful. So now this is going to be dynamic. Notice how I'm getting 47. So of course I can only show you that if I go back to my complete application and do some kind of request because we still haven't set up our star application. But remember, we are using our API right now for those requests. That's why when I go back and when I refresh, this is going to be already 44. So that's what I was trying to tell you all the time, that the IP address is the one that's important, not the user you're searching for or anything like that. So now once I can show the requests, like I keep on mentioning, I also would want to hide the button. So if there are no requests available, then I would want to hide my button. So here I have my button, and we could set up with conditional where I'm going to say requests. If the request is bigger than 0, only then show my button. So do and operator will cut out my button and place it over here. So now what happens? Only if we have requests, then we display it. Now, of course, the easiest way for me to show you that is by heading over to the context, and instead of passing in remaining, could just say 0. And there it is. Now, of course, you won't see the button, well, because we have used up all our requests. So let's pass in the remaining. And now we have already some functionality where we check the requests the moment the app loads. And then depending on that, we display them here in requests and also show or hide the button.